Hello, everyone. Welcome to Raquel Teaches Web Development. My name is Raquel, and in this lesson, I'm going to be teaching you about HTML semantic elements. Okay, really, it's going to be about more like me talking about the semantic elements, what they mean, and how to select and use them appropriately in your web development projects. All right. This lesson is loosely based on the lesson you will find at W3 Schools, which I'm showing here on the screen, and which you will also find a link to in the description for this video. All right. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to show you a few examples in the code editor so you can understand what semantic elements are. All right. It's very simple, very easy to understand. And I hope that after you watch this, you are able to start using semantic elements correctly. So here we go. So let's switch over to our handy dandy code editor. All right. So what I mean, or what is meant by semantic elements, is using its elements that are designated in the HTML language to have a specific meaning and use, right? And so some of the easier ones that are very common and come to mind are things like the form tag, right? Or the table tag. And so those elements are used to create the things that they're named after, right? They're used to create forms. They're used to create tables. We even have things like the input tag, right? That create an item where users can input information onto the screen, and that's usually combined with a form tag. And so right off the bat, we see what we mean by semantic elements, right? Elements that are very specific to a use. But what we also see is that sometimes people put content on web pages and designate them any old kind of way. So what I mean by that is I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Like, you guys have probably seen something like this. People start to, actually, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger for y'all. Oh, that looks a little bit better. All right. This is live, so please don't laugh at me if I seem surprised at stuff, because sometimes I'm not sure if it's going to work as far as like my web streaming stuff. So anyway, so let's look at our code editor again, right? And so when we look at the code editor, sometimes you look at people's coding, you see something like this, right? And they'll create that, and then they put ID equals nav, right? And then they'll put other ones like, another div and give it an ID, and they'll call this like, property list, or let's just call it list, right? And web developers will do stuff like that, right? And they do it sometimes because that's what they were taught, and other times because it's laziness. And really, it's a little worse than laziness, because they don't even need to come up with an ID, because there are elements already made to represent a lot of things that people create IDs for. And as we know, IDs need to be unique. So as long as we have access to semantic elements, meaning elements that are designated for particular things, we should be using them, not doing things like creating a div and then giving it a unique ID, and then hoping that we don't need to use that kind of ID name for something else. And, don't make more work for yourself. Using semantic IDs is the way to go. For one, it gives proper structure to your document. And two, it makes sure that your web page is accessible to a broader range of people, right? Because I've talked before about how websites are not just for people who have all their seeing and hearing faculties, right? It's also for people who can't necessarily see anything or at all. And so to take those users into consideration, we want to make sure that we use semantic elements so that when their devices or where their software are reading things, right, that they read the information correctly. Another benefit of using semantic elements is that it does help search engines determine whether or not your information is appropriate for the topic being searched, categorized, or formatted correctly, and they decide to serve that as a search result or not. So you want to make sure that whenever possible, you're using semantic elements in your web development projects. So this is an example of, generally speaking, what not to do. And you will notice that if you ever visited my website, I still have some divs on my website. So I need to be accountable for that and go ahead and remove those things. Because again, I was also being lazy using a template. So yeah, I needed to like not be doing that. So that's one of the next projects, get rid of all the divs on my website. But in the meantime, I'm going to get some practicing on my own. And I'm going to show you guys what I mean. So just very briefly, I'm going to switch back to the browser because I want to show you guys something about semantic elements. Also, let me try to also make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see, right? But what you'll see is that when you get a chance to click through that article, what you'll see is that it starts to give an example, right? And it has a list. Now understand that this list of semantic elements is not the exhaustive list, all right? If you go to the HTML documentation from the W3C, which is the W3C, it's called the W3 Consortium, right? Which is I guess the holder of HTML documentation. You'll see that the list of tags that are semantic for HTML is much greater than that. The W3C website, though, is kind of sucky to use. So I always recommend either using the Mozilla Developer Network website to look up tags or even using W3 Schools. Because when you get to the bottom of this lesson here, you will find that they do provide a list. Besides the ones that they mentioned in the article, they're going to provide a list here where it says, for a complete list of all tags, you can visit their tag reference. And so when you do that, you'll be able to see a whole bunch of stuff. And so when we do that, you can see that there are all kinds of semantic tags, right? And it's helpful to every once in a while go through these things because there may be one that's most appropriate for your content. So just starting off looking at this list, you see one that's called ABBR for abbreviations. One for address, one for article, aside, right? Some of these things, you have no idea what they mean, so they're not necessarily semantic, but they do have a good definition of what they're used for, right? But for instance, here's another one, block quote. Oops, didn't mean to highlight that whole thing. Block quote, right? And so you can, canvas is, well, it is kind of a semantic element. It's used to draw stuff. So I guess in a way, it is a semantic element. But as you go through this list, data list is another good one. You will see that there are lots of semantic elements. And so whenever you're displaying content on your web page, you should be using them. So just let me show you a quick example back at the code editor so you can see. So in this one where I'm using a div for navigation and another div for list, a better representation of that would be something like, the nav element. And by the way, I'm not sure, again, I haven't checked on this yet. Can you guys see that? Okay, so the contextual menus don't show up, but when you're using Visual Studio Code and you start to type an element, it will give, let me back up. Now I start to type NAV is an element, which stands for navigation. But as I start typing it, before I select that element name to be inserted and auto-completed for me, it will give me a definition. So when I do that, it has a pop-up here and it says, the nav element represents a section of a page that links to other pages or to parts within the page, a section with navigational links, right? So that's what we all call a navigation menu, or just for most people, a menu, right? And so instead of using something like div and giving it an ID of nav to represent your navigation menu, you really should be using the element tag that's nav, okay? And the same thing for a list, right? We actually already have an element that represents a list, right? So if you remember that, there's actually two elements that we can use to represent a list. So really, when you see something like this, that's really not that useful at all because we don't know what type of list it is. Is it an ordered list or an unordered list, right? So instead of using a div and giving it an ID of list, what we should be doing is something like this. We should be putting UL, right? Unordered list, or, ordered list. And then putting the list items in between them. Okay. And so that is really all there is to it, to making good use of semantic elements when coding HTML. If you can't think of what the tag name is when you're writing out the code, then just look up a reference. whether it's at Mozilla Developer Network or W3 Schools. And actually, let me see if I can just pull up Mozilla Developer Network so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so I'm going to type in, yeah, I actually go there pretty often. But if you go to Mozilla Developer Network, they have sections for each of the web development languages. And let me just make this a little bit. Can I make this a little bit smaller? Oops. Hold on. Let me make this a little bit smaller here. This is why I should have never resized it in the first place while I'm live. But lesson learned. All right. So if we're up here and in this discussion on their website, they start to have, some list of elements that are that they try to explain. But if you click on one of the elements, it starts to, it gives you the whole definition of it, right? So Mozilla Developer Network is pretty good with that. Any element name, oh, I'm sorry, and on the left there is a list of the elements, but any element name that you click on, it will give you the definition of it, how it is used, if there are any attributes that can be included with it and what those attributes are and how they're used, etc. But here on the left, there is a drop down menu for HTML elements. And so when you click that, you'll notice that it has a list of elements starting with A all the way down to, like, I guess if there's one with a Z, I have no idea. There's probably a whole ton of HTML elements. I have never personally used all of them. I don't know anyone has used all of them. I don't think any developer will ever need to use all of them. But that's how you can get to the Mozilla Developer Network. Just Google it and get on there. And it's a great resource for looking up HTML elements, what they mean, but specifically looking up stuff that has semantic meaning that's good for structuring and displaying the content on the website. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. If you like this video, please hit the like button and be sure to share it with someone you know that might like it or find it helpful. And if you would like to be notified of future live streams, go ahead and click the subscribe button for this channel, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks a lot. Have a good day and God bless.